The night after we buried my brother Silas, his daughter-in-law was already texting me about the cabin. Not his daughter-in-law by blood. Not by anything Silas had ever announced at a dinner table or signed on a form. Elena was married to my nephew Roscoe, and in the 23 years she had been part of this family, she had spoken to Silas maybe 30 times. 30 polite times. Holiday table times. The kind of times where you pass the salt and ask how the drive was and say nothing that matters. But Silas was not even cold yet, and she had already started counting. His casket was dark polished wood. The cemetery sat on a low hill outside Lynchburg, the grass brown and brittle in the August heat, the sky white and heavy. I stood there in the same black suit I wore to bury my wife Doreen 12 years before, and I watched the last man who had known me as a boy disappear into the ground. The pastor's voice came through the heat like something far away. I kept my eyes on the casket because if I looked up, I was going to see something I did not want to see on my family's faces. I had already seen enough. My niece Hadwin stood 2 feet away from me in dark sunglasses, checking her phone between prayers. She was 44, sharp as a filed tax return, the kind of person who treats every room like a negotiation. Roscoe stood beside her in expensive shoes that were wrong for the season, his hands never quite still. Elena was half a step behind him, wearing a composed, careful smile that she applied the way some people apply sunscreen, evenly, protectively, without meaning any of it. When the pastor closed his Bible, I waited. I waited for someone to hug me. I waited for a hand on my shoulder. I waited for one small sign that grief had arrived before greed did. Instead, Elena reached me before the pastor had finished shaking hands. "Uncle August," she said, her voice smooth and quiet, like she was being considerate of the occasion, "we should discuss the cabin before everyone scatters. Roscoe and Hadwin are next of kin. Since Silas didn't leave a will, the property goes through probate. We've already reached out to an appraiser." I stared at her. The appraiser? For my father's cabin on Smith Mountain Lake. The place where Silas and I learned to bait a hook, clean a fish, and sit still without needing to fill the silence. The place where our father once said that a man who can be quiet around water is a man worth knowing. I looked at Elena's composed face. Then I looked at my brother's grave. "Elena," I said, keeping my voice where I wanted it to stay, "his casket is still above the dirt." She gave me a patient little smile. The kind people wear when they have decided that sentiment is an obstacle. "We thought you deserved to know early," she said. "Out of courtesy." That word, courtesy. I was still hearing it when I reached my truck. My phone buzzed. Hadwin. A text message asking if I still had a spare key to the cabin because they needed to make sure nothing went missing before the appraisal. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat. Roscoe called twice on the drive home. I let both calls ring through. I went home alone that evening and skipped the reception. I could not stand the thought of watching them balance paper plates of funeral ham while Silas's grave was still settling. So I sat at my kitchen table in Roanoke with the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead and 2 fingers of bourbon I barely touched, and I thought about the last strange thing my brother had ever said to me. It had been 3 weeks before he died. A Sunday evening, just after 7, our usual call time. We talked for 40 minutes about the usual things. The Cardinals were having a rough season. His right knee was giving him trouble again. He had seen a red-tailed hawk sitting on his fence post that morning and described it the way he described everything beautiful, quietly and with patience, like he was in no hurry for the image to leave him. Then, just before he hung up, his voice shifted. "Augie," he said, "if something happens to me, the box is at Tidewater Trust in Marlow Springs. You'll know the name." I had laughed. I told him to stop being dramatic. He chuckled and said, "Forget I said it. Old men get strange after supper." Then he changed the subject. Sitting at that table now, with Elena's words still stuck in my chest like a splinter, those two sentences came back so clearly it felt like Silas had walked in and sat down across from me. The box is at Tidewater Trust, Marlow Springs. I knew the name because Silas had driven there every second Tuesday for 32 years. He said he was visiting an old army buddy named Henry Coltrane, a man he had served alongside who was sick and needed company. I had never questioned it. When your brother is the most dependable man you have ever known and he looks you straight in the eye, you believe him. But sitting alone in my kitchen that night, for the first time in my life, I wondered whether Henry Coltrane had ever breathed a single breath. I did not sleep well. I lay in the dark and ran through every conversation I could remember about Henry. Every detail Silas had ever offered. A man in poor health. Lived alone, no family nearby. Silas would bring groceries sometimes. Sit with him a few hours, drive home. The details were thin, I realize now. Believable thin. The kind of thin that only shows when you pull on the thread. By 6 in the morning, I was dressed. I called Tidewater Trust from the landline in my kitchen, the way I handle anything important. A woman answered. I gave her my name, then Silas's name, and asked whether my brother had maintained a safe deposit box at their branch. The line went quiet. Not the dead quiet of a wrong number. The waiting quiet of someone who had been trained to say certain things in a certain order. She asked me to hold, and I stood there with the receiver pressed to my ear for almost 4 minutes, staring at the brown coffee ring Silas had left on my table the last time he visited. He always set his mug down in the same spot. I had stopped wiping it away years ago. When the woman came back, her voice was lower, more careful. Mr. Peaton, she said, would you be able to come to the branch in person today? I am nearly 3 hours away. We will wait, she said. That was all. I left Roanoke before 8. The green hills of Virginia rolled past the windows, soft and familiar, but I was not seeing the scenery. I was trying to think clearly about what I did not know, which turned out to be more than I had expected. Marlow Springs was smaller than I had pictured. 1 main street. A Civil War monument in a traffic circle, a diner with hand-lettered window signs, and a few old brick storefronts that had made peace with not changing. The kind of town that people pass through on the way to somewhere else and immediately forget. Tidewater Trust occupied what had once been a hardware store. The brick was faded and the brass door handle had been worn smooth by more hands than I could count. Inside, it smelled of paper and floor wax, and something older underneath. The smell of money kept quietly for a long time. A woman behind the counter looked up before the door had finished closing. Her name tag said Beatrix. Silver hair, pinned back. Reading glasses on a chain, maybe 65. Careful in the way that older women in small-town banks often are, unhurried, observant, and completely unsurprised by my presence. She came around the counter herself. Mr. Peaton, she asked. I nodded. Your brother told us you might come one day, she said. Please follow me. She led me past the teller windows, down a hallway where the air felt cooler than the rest of the building, to a steel door with a keypad. She pressed in a code with quiet confidence, and the lock gave a sound that tightened something in my stomach. Inside was a private room, long oak table, walls lined with steel safe deposit boxes, fluorescent light overhead. The room felt like a place where serious things had been handled seriously for a very long time. Beatrix asked me to wait. A few minutes later, she returned with a tall, thin man in a navy suit that hung a little loose on his shoulders. White hair, wire-rimmed glasses, the steady, clear eyes of someone accustomed to being the last calm person in a difficult room. Mr. Peaton, he said, extending his hand, I am Curtis Mullen, branch manager, and your brother's closest friend in this world. I am very sorry for your loss. That sentence struck me harder than I was ready for. This man, this stranger, had known a part of Silas I had never been allowed to see. Curtis took a brass key from his jacket pocket, worn smooth at the edge, and walked to box 218. He inserted his key first, then handed me another one, Silas's key. My hand was not as steady as I wanted it to be. The lock turned. Curtis slid out the steel container and placed it on the oak table. "Take all the time you need," he said, and stepped out. I stood alone with the box for a full minute before I lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of manila envelopes arranged in the careful, deliberate order that Silas brought to everything in his life, each one labeled in his square, heavy handwriting. The envelope on top said, "For Augie, first." I sat down. Then I opened it. Inside was a 3-page letter on yellow legal paper dated 2 years before his death. The first line nearly took the air out of the room. "Augie, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I am sorry I never told you the truth while I was alive." I put my hand over my mouth and sat there for a moment before I could continue. Silas wrote that Henry Coltrane had never existed. Henry was a name he had invented because the truth was too tender, too private, and in his mind too complicated to carry into a conversation without it changing everything. So he built a simple story and drove behind it for 32 years. The real reason he drove to Marlow Springs began in 1991, when Silas was 36 and hauling a tanker through eastern Tennessee. One rainy evening outside Bristol, he pulled into a roadside diner for coffee and meatloaf. That was where he met Cordelia Vance. She was 28, divorced. Raising a 4-year-old daughter, everyone called June Bug. Silas wrote that Cordelia had tired eyes and a way of pouring coffee that made the whole room feel less cruel for a minute. He said he asked her to dinner before he had finished his pie. They were together, quietly and in their own private way, for 18 years. But Silas never married her, never moved in, not because he did not want to. He wrote that he wanted it more than anything he had ever wanted in his life. But Cordelia's first husband had beaten the trust out of her so thoroughly that even love felt like a door she was afraid to walk through if it opened too wide. She told Silas she could love him only if she still had her own home, her own bed, her own life. So my brother did what patient, decent men do when love asks for something that looks like sacrifice. He stayed near. In 1993, he bought a small house 2 streets over from Cordelia's in Marlow Springs. Every second Tuesday, without fail, he drove 90 miles to sit on her porch and love her exactly the way she needed to be loved. He fixed the loose railing on her porch steps. He changed the oil in her car and never let her pay him back. He sat at her kitchen table during thunderstorms because June Bug was afraid of thunder, and he never once told that child she was being silly. June Bug was 4 when he met her. Pigtails, scraped knees, a habit of hiding behind her mother's apron when strangers came through the diner door. By the time she was 7, she was running down the sidewalk when she saw his truck turn the corner. By 12, she was saving her report cards for him. By 17, she asked him to stand in the front row at her high school graduation because she wanted to see his face when she crossed the stage. He paid for that graduation dress. He paid her college application fees. He helped cover nursing school tuition. He helped her buy her first used car, a beat-up thing that Cordelia said looked like it had survived a disaster, but it got June Bug safely to class every morning, and that was what mattered. When June Bug married a good man named Wilkes, Silas walked with her partway down the aisle. Not as her father, he was careful to write because he would never claim a title that was not rightfully his, but as the man who had shown up long enough and consistently enough that love had quietly become a fact between them. I had spent 32 years thinking my brother was lonely. I had felt sorry for him at Christmas, driving home to an empty house. I had sometimes worried he had never built anything worth coming home to. But Silas had not been lonely. Silas had a porch, Sunday dinners, a little girl who grew into a woman and still saved a chair for him at her table, a child named after him who was sleeping in a crib somewhere 90 miles from where I sat reading this letter. He had a family, and I had never known the first thing about it. I stayed in that room for a long time, rereading pages I had already read, trying to let the shape of things settle. My brother had not hidden this life out of shame. He had hidden it out of protection, for Cordelia, for June Bug, and in some way I did not yet fully understand, for me. I thought that was the deepest secret in the box. I was wrong. Under the letter was a thicker envelope labeled "The Numbers." Inside was a bound financial statement with a notarized cover page. I read the numbers twice because the first time did not convince me they were real. $41,620,000. I stood up so quickly the chair scraped against the floor. A moment later, I opened the door. Curtis was waiting in the hallway as if he had expected this exact moment. I held the statement out toward him without saying anything. He looked at the page, then at my face. "Yes," he said quietly, "every cent of it." I stood there in the doorway of that little room while the number rearranged everything I had believed about my brother's life. Curtis explained it calmly, the way men explain things they have understood for a long time. In 1983, when our father died and left each of us $40,000, I used mine as a down payment on the house where I raised my children. Silas did something different. He drove to Marlow Springs and walked into Tidewater Trust and handed a young financial advisor named Curtis Mullen every dollar of his inheritance and told him, "Do something smart with it." Curtis had. Then he had done something smart again, and again. Over 4 decades, while Silas hauled tankers through rain and mountain fog and lonely stretches of interstate, his money had been doing the one thing patient, boring money does best. It had grown. Blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds, index funds, when most working men I knew still thought those were something complicated and foreign. 2 pieces of land outside Marlow Springs that later became commercial lots. A stake in a regional storage company that expanded faster than anyone predicted. Investments stacked on top of older investments, compounding quietly year after year. The kind of decisions that do not look like anything remarkable in any given month and look like a miracle when you open a folder 30 years later. My brother had not died a lonely old trucker with a bird feeder and a fishing cabin. He had died one of the wealthiest private individuals in the county. And not one person at that funeral had known the first thing about the man they were already dividing up. I thought the money was the part that would change everything. Then I opened the next envelope. It was labeled, "The Others." Inside was a green ledger with a black cloth spine, the old-fashioned accountant kind, filled in Silas's handwriting with dated entries stretching back nearly 20 years. I set it on the oak table and started at the beginning. The first name I saw was Hadwin's. In 2006, the year she graduated college, Hadwin had borrowed $2,000 from my wife Doreen. She said it was for the security deposit on her first apartment. Doreen had given it to her without hesitation, because Doreen believed that family helped family and did not need to be asked twice. Hadwin used the money for the down payment on a leased BMW. The actual landlord called the cabin number by mistake, looking for a co-signer. That was how Silas found out. Rather than embarrass Doreen, rather than let the truth reach her, Silas quietly paid the security deposit himself. Then, over several months, he slipped Doreen cash, let her believe Hadwin had done the right thing on her own. I turned the pages slowly. There were more entries, dozens of them, different amounts, different years, different excuses. By the time Doreen got sick, Hadwin had borrowed over $31,000 from her and never repaid a single dollar. My wife died believing her niece had made everything right. Silas made sure she believed that. Then came the entries for Roscoe. In 2014, a fraud investigation in Greensboro had involved inflated real estate appraisals and falsified paperwork. A witness had been prepared to speak. Silas located that witness and arranged for $85,000 in exchange for the man packing up and relocating to Florida. He did not tell Roscoe. He did not ask for thanks. He just made the problem disappear so quietly that Roscoe himself may never have understood how close he came to a courtroom. Then came Elena. An affair, photographs taken by a private investigator, a separate settlement of $40,000 to bury the file. Then hotel damage in a city Roscoe had not told Elena he was visiting. Then escort charges on a secondary account. Then a tax issue that had been growing quietly for years. One mess after another, each one quietly resolved by the man in the worn denim jacket, who drove a truck that rattled when it turned left. By the final page of that ledger, Silas had spent over $600,000 cleaning up after the people who had stood at his graveside and talked about appraisals. I closed the ledger with both hands. For a long while, I just sat in that small room and breathed. How does a man carry all of that for 20 years without saying a word? How does he sit at the same holiday table with people he has had to rescue from their own worst behavior and smile and pass the salt and ask how the drive was? I thought of Elena that morning, at the cemetery, saying the word courtesy like she had invented it. I thought of Hadwin checking her phone between prayers. I thought of Roscoe calling me twice on the drive home. And then I thought about Silas, driving home alone from Marlow Springs every second Tuesday for 32 years, with all of this knowledge riding beside him, and never saying a word to anyone. Not even to me. When I finally stepped into the hallway, Curtis looked at my face and understood what I had found without needing to ask. "I want to meet her," I said. He nodded. "Junebug?" The name felt strange in my mouth, tender and borrowed. "Yes." Curtis made one phone call from his office, his voice low and unhurried. Less than an hour later, the front door of the bank opened, and a woman in her late 30s stepped inside with a small boy, balanced on her hip. I knew who she was before anyone said her name. She had her mother's kind eyes, tired around the edges in the way that people get when they have done real work and real grieving. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and the boy on her hip had one sticky hand wrapped around a toy truck and was studying me with the focused suspicion of a child who takes strangers seriously. Curtis stood and said, "June, this is August Peaton, Silas's brother." She looked at me for 1 second. Then her face broke open. She crossed the room and hugged me with one arm, holding the boy on her hip with the other, and cried into my shoulder like she had known me all her life. "He talked about you every single day," she whispered. "He called you the smart one. He used to say you were the smartest man he knew." Then she gave a short, broken laugh and wiped her face with the back of her hand. "He never missed my birthday," she said. "Not once. The year his hip was so bad he could barely climb out of the truck, he still drove down with a grocery store cake and a card signed in that awful handwriting of his." I looked down at the little boy on her hip. He was studying me with large, serious eyes. "What's his name?" I asked. Junebug pressed her lips together for a moment before she could answer. "Silas," she said. "Silas Augustus Wilkes." I had to look away. My brother had not left me a secret. He had left me a family. If you have ever lost someone and then discovered you barely knew them at all, subscribe and tell me in the comments. This story is nowhere near finished. I drove back to Roanoke that evening with the green ledger on the passenger seat. and Junebug's tears still warm somewhere in my chest. The sun was dropping behind the Blue Ridge and turning the windshield gold, but I was not watching the road the way I usually do. I was running numbers in my head. Not the financial kind, the other kind. The kind you count when you are trying to understand how much of a person you had missed. 32 years of Tuesdays. 18 years with a woman he loved in a way she could survive being loved. A child who had called out for him from a sidewalk and saved her report cards and grown up and named her own son after the man who had never asked for the title of father. And 3 other people I shared blood with, who had spent those same years taking money they had not earned, causing damage they never cleaned up, and trusting that someone quieter and more decent than themselves would absorb the cost without complaint. He had absorbed it without a single complaint, but he had also written it all down. By the time I reached my kitchen table, I had made up my mind. I called Curtis Malin the next morning. "I need Silas's lawyer," I said. Curtis did not pause. "His name is Hollister Faxon. He has been waiting for your call." I heard something in that sentence, not just information. The particular patience of a man who has been holding a door open for a long time and is relieved to finally see someone walking toward it. Hollister arrived at my house that afternoon in a dark sedan with a leather briefcase that looked older than my children. He was a small man, silver-haired, wire-rimmed glasses, the dry and steady voice of someone who had spent his career telling people things they were not ready to hear, and had gotten very good at delivering those things without flinching. He sat across from me at my kitchen table and placed a thick folder between us. "Mr. Petton," he said, "your brother did leave a will." I felt my breath stop. "Signed, witnessed, notarized, and filed 8 years ago. You are named as sole executor." He slid the first page toward me. "And June Vance Wilkes is the primary beneficiary." The room went very quiet. Junebug, primary beneficiary, not Hadwin, not Roscoe, not the blood relatives who had started measuring his life in dollar signs before his casket was in the ground. The little girl with pigtails and scraped knees who had grown into a woman and named her son after the man who had shown up every second Tuesday without fail. Hollister let the silence hold for a moment. Then he turned another page. "There are also specific bequests. A gift to Curtis Malin, a donation to the Children's Hospital in Bristol made in Cordelia Vance's name, and a private sum left to you." He pointed to a number on the page. I looked at it, then I looked away. It was more money than Doreen and I had ever dreamed about when we were young and clipping grocery coupons at this same kitchen table. But Hollister was not finished. "There is one more clause," he said, and his voice sharpened just slightly around the edges, the way a good knife sounds when you drag it slow across a stone. He removed a separate document from the folder. Attached to it were bank transfer confirmations, canceled checks, wire receipts, and a summary sheet. He placed it on the table and let me read the cover before he said anything else. "Your brother documented every substantial amount he paid on behalf of Hadwin, Roscoe, and Elena over the years. Under the will, those payments are classified as recoverable loans upon his death." I looked up at him. "Loans?" "Yes," he said, "with interest calculated at the prime rate." He turned the summary sheet so I could read the total. $741,000. I read it once, then again. $741,000. More than 2 decades of cleanup. More than 2 decades of protection that was never asked for and never acknowledged. Money spent so quietly and so consistently that the people it saved had probably forgotten the debt even existed, or had told themselves it was not really a debt, or had simply decided that someone like Silas, someone steady and patient and undemanding, would carry the weight forever without needing to be thanked. Hollister folded his hands on top of the folder. The estate has the legal right to demand full repayment. 30 days to resolve it voluntarily, after which we can file suit, attach wages, freeze accounts, and pursue collection through every available channel. I leaned back in my chair. I thought about my brother hauling tankers in the rain, while this money quietly piled up in places no one knew about. I thought about him sitting at Roscoe's holiday table and passing the bread without ever once letting on that he knew what he knew. I thought about Elena standing at the cemetery with her composed smile, saying the word courtesy. For the first time since the funeral, I did not feel helpless. I felt Silas standing right behind me. 3 days later, Hollister and I sat across a conference room table from Hadwin, Roscoe, and Elena on the 4th floor of a law office in downtown Roanoke. I had told them it was a family meeting about Silas's affairs. That was true. I simply did not specify whose affairs would be receiving the most attention. Hadwin arrived first, navy suit, leather folio, the posture of someone who had already decided what the outcome was going to be. Roscoe followed, pale and restless, smoothing his tie every few seconds without seeming to notice he was doing it. Elena entered last, heels clicking evenly, her face arranged in its usual careful calm. Hollister opened politely. He explained that Silas had in fact left a legal will, signed, witnessed, notarized, filed 8 years prior. Elena's eyes narrowed by a fraction. Hadwin sat straighter. Roscoe said, "How much are we talking about?" Hollister looked down at the document in front of him. The estate is valued at approximately $41,620,000 after taxes and applicable expenses. The room went silent. Not uncomfortable silent, stunned silent. The kind of silence where calculation tries to keep up with information and cannot. Elena's mouth opened slightly. Hadwin's fingers tightened around her pen. Roscoe looked at me as if I had somehow stolen something from him simply by knowing the truth before he did. Then Hollister told them about June Bug. He explained Cordelia. He explained the 32 years. He explained the safe deposit box, the legal bequests, and the fact that June Vance Wilkes, and not any blood relative present in that room, was named primary beneficiary of Silas's estate. Hadwin's face moved through stages the way weather moves through before a storm. Confusion first, then a fast, sharp anger that made her look both younger and older than 44. "This is fraud," she said. "That woman has no legal claim. She is not a Peaton." Hollister did not blink. "Legal claim," he said, "is determined by the documented wishes of the deceased, and your uncle was exceptionally clear." Elena leaned forward then, her voice dropping into the smooth, practiced tone she used when she wanted ordinary people to feel small. "We are supposed to accept that a waitress's daughter receives $40 million while his actual family receives nothing?" I looked at her for the first time since we had sat down. "You treated blood like a financial instrument the moment you thought it was going to pay out," I said. "Funny how family becomes important when there is $41 million on the other side of the table." Elena was the first to recover. She straightened her back and folded her arms. "We will contest the will," she said. Hollister looked at her over the rim of his glasses. "You are welcome to try," he said. "The will includes a no contest clause. Any individual who challenges it forfeits whatever conditional interest your uncle chose to extend to them." Hadwin made a short, dismissive sound. "We are not beneficiaries. We have nothing to forfeit." For the first time that morning, Hollister almost smiled. "That is not entirely accurate." He opened the folder again and removed one final document. Blue cover sheet, several notarized pages, a deed attached at the back. He placed it on the table slowly and without ceremony. Hadwin glanced at it, then away. The way someone looks at a thing they are afraid to confirm is real. "This pertains to the cabin on Smith Mountain Lake," Hollister said. Elena leaned forward at that, because the cabin had been the prize all along. Not because anyone in that room loved it. Not because of the way our father's voice sounded when he named the fish. Not because of the sound the dock made in the early morning when the water was still and the air smelled like cedar. To them, the cabin was waterfront footage, an appraisal number, a commission waiting to be collected.
In 2009, Hollister continued, your uncle transferred the cabin into a private trust. The named beneficiary of that trust is June Vance Wilkes. The cabin has not been part of your uncle's personal estate for approximately 15 years. The deed was recorded with the county. Property taxes have been paid through the trust annually. Every maintenance expense has been documented and drawn from trust funds.
Roscoe blinked several times. That cannot be right. It is right, Hollister said. Elena turned to look at Roscoe, then back at Hollister. We already contacted an appraiser, she said, her voice just slightly thinner than before. I looked at her and said, that sounds like your problem. No one spoke. Outside the conference room windows, Roanoke went about its afternoon. Somewhere, on the street below, a truck made a delivery. A light changed. Someone's day continued in the ordinary way that days continue when they are not receiving the kind of information being received in that room. Silas had been underestimated his entire life by people who mistook quiet for weakness, but quiet had not been weakness. It had been strategy. Patient, legal, meticulous strategy executed over decades by a man in a rattling pickup truck who clipped coupons for birdseed and drove 90 miles every 2 weeks for love. And from the grave, without raising his voice once, he had just taken the cabin out from under them before they touched the door. That was when Roscoe broke. Not all at once. First, his mouth opened without producing words. His eyes moved from the deed to Hollister to me, looking for the seam in the wall that had just enclosed him. When he found none, his face folded. Uncle August, he said, barely above a whisper. I had not heard that voice from him in years. Not the broker voice, not the polished voice. The boy voice, the voice of the nephew who used to spend 2 weeks at my house every summer and cried once because he lost the baseball mitt I bought him for his 9th birthday. I have a kid, he said, a mortgage. I cannot come up with that kind of money. One part of me, the old part, wanted to soften. Doreen would have reached across the table. She would have tried to find mercy somewhere in the rubble. But Doreen had died believing Hadwin had paid her back. Roscoe, I said, keeping my voice level, my brother gave you a life he did not owe you. He protected you in Greensboro. He protected Elena's secret to spare your marriage, so Doran would not die with a broken heart. He spent more than $600,000 cleaning up messes that were never his to clean. Roscoe's shoulders shook. And you repaid him by reaching for his property before the dirt had settled on his coffin. Hadwin looked at the table. Elena stared at the wall. You will pay back what you owe, I said, with interest. And if it takes you 15 years, then every single payment will be a reminder that love is not free just because someone is too decent to hand you the bill while they are still alive. Then I picked up the green ledger, stood, and walked out before grief could talk me into letting any of them off the hook. Karma, I have learned, does not announce itself. It comes in envelopes, in late notices, in phone calls from attorneys, in the slow, grinding collapse of everything a person built on borrowed confidence and other people's silence. Roscoe was the first to buckle. 30 days came and went, and he could not pay the full amount. Of course he could not. Men like Roscoe build themselves on the appearance of resources and call it success until the day someone who actually understands finances reads the file. Hollister negotiated a structured repayment plan through the estate. Every month, Roscoe had to send money back to the brother he had never respected. A fixed amount, documented, unavoidable, arriving in the estate account like a clock counting down a debt. I heard later that the lake boat went first, the country club membership after that. Then the second car. His wife's family stopped coming for the holidays. His name disappeared from a few social lists that matter in certain circles. The life he had carefully arranged to impress other people slowly sold itself off, piece by piece, paying back the man whose funeral he had barely attended before looking for the appraisal number. Hadwin fought harder, because Hadwin always did. She hired 2 separate attorneys, got the same answer from both, and then made the mistake of stopping payment on a tax account she had been managing quietly for years. When an old client filed a complaint with the state licensing board, the investigation turned up the personal tax problem she had never disclosed. 9 months later, the certification she had worn like a badge at every family gathering was suspended. 6 months after that, it was revoked. The bankruptcy filing came before the year was out. Elena was simply gone. Once it became clear there was nothing left to inherit and no easy money waiting on the other side of Roscoe's name, her devotion evaporated with a speed that would have been impressive if it had not also been so predictable. She relocated to somewhere outside Atlanta with a man whose name I never cared enough to learn. I did not celebrate any of it. I want to be honest about that. I did not throw parties or make phone calls or keep a list. I did not need to. Silas had kept the records. Hollister held the documents. The legal system did what legal systems do when someone hands them clean, accurate paperwork and enough documented evidence to fill a briefcase. Truth did what anger never could. It made them face themselves. And that, I have come to understand, is the cleanest kind of consequence. Not cruelty. Not revenge in the loud, dramatic sense. Just records, patience, clearly drawn lines, and the quiet satisfaction of watching people finally meet the version of reality they had spent years outrunning. After the conference room, my life did not become louder. It became quieter in a different way, a settled way. I stopped waiting for an apology from Hadwin. I stopped wondering whether Roscoe would ever understand what he had cost himself. I stopped thinking about Elena altogether. Some people are not meant to return with changed hearts. Some people are only meant to leave behind a lesson sharp enough that you carry the cut for the rest of your life, and are more careful for it. What I did instead was drive. Every second Tuesday of the month, I got in my truck before sunrise and made the same 90-mile trip my brother had made for 32 years. The first time, I half expected the road to feel like trespassing, like I was walking through someone else's private life. But somewhere past the second ridge, with the morning fog still lifting off the fields, something shifted. I understood. This road had not been a lie. It had been a love letter Silas wrote 12 times a year, with his own hands on the steering wheel. I started stopping at the diner in Marlow Springs where Cordelia had worked all those years ago. The waitress there knew my order by the third visit. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, black coffee, and apple pie if they had it. That was Silas's order, so that was my order now. I always left a generous tip, not because anyone expected it, but because Cordelia had walked those floors with tired feet and something like hope in the back of her chest, and I wanted to honor the place where my brother first understood what love was for. Then I drove to June Bug's house. The first time I brought photographs, our father holding a fish at the cabin, Silas at 16 with grease on his cheek from working on a neighbor's truck, Doreen laughing on the porch at a 4th of July that felt like it happened in another lifetime. June Bug held each one like it was a key to a room she had been standing outside of for years. Her boy, Silas Augustus, called me Uncle Augie by the 2nd month. By the 4th, he had stopped asking why I had not always been there. I stopped explaining. There was one more thing Silas left me. I did not find it the day I first opened the steel box. There had been too much else in that room. Too many numbers, too many names, too much truth arriving all at once for the eye to catch everything. But a week later, when Curtis and I went through the contents again with Hollister present, I noticed a plain white card tucked beneath the last envelope at the bottom of the box. No label, no date. Just my name written on the front in Silas's heavy block handwriting. Augie. I held that card for a long moment before I opened it. By then, I already knew about Cordelia. I had met June Bug. I had seen the estate documents and the green ledger and the legal trust for the cabin, and the careful lines my brother had drawn before death could erase his voice. I thought I had received the largest thing he had to give. But nothing in that box broke me the way those two sentences did. Augie, you were never the smart one. You were the good one. Be good a little longer for me. I read it standing in Curtis's office and had to put my hand on the wall. Not because the words stung. God knows, Silas was right. I had always believed he was the clever one, the quiet one who read rooms and understood people from the corner of his eye before they understood themselves. He had proven that beyond any argument in the documents that were now sitting on Hollister's desk. But his final words to me, the ones he had sealed in a card and tucked at the bottom of a steel box in a small town bank, were about goodness, not intelligence, not strategy, not money, not even justice. He called me good. After everything I had learned, I was not entirely sure I deserved it. But I put that card in my wallet behind Doreen's photograph, and every morning before I get out of bed, I read it once. On every second Tuesday, before I drive to Marlow Springs, I read it twice. Once when I leave, and once when I come home. Because my brother spent 32 years driving that road for someone he loved. And I figure I owe him at least the rest of my life trying to be the kind of man he believed I already was. Looking back now, 2 years from the day I first drove home from Marlow Springs, with that green ledger on the passenger seat, I understand something I did not understand standing at the grave. The real inheritance was not the $41 million. It was not the cabin, not the trust documents, not the stacked evidence that made 3 greedy people sit up straight in a conference room and start sweating through expensive clothes. The real inheritance was the way my brother lived when no one was watching. He loved Cordelia without trying to own her. He raised Junebug without demanding a title. He protected Doreen's heart without asking for credit. He covered Roscoe and Hadwin and Elena for years, not because they deserved rescue, but because he believed the truth would hurt me more than his silence hurt him. I wish he had been wrong. I wish he had trusted me with the weight. But I cannot argue with what he taught me. Decency is not weakness. Patience is not surrender. Silence is not emptiness. Sometimes silence is where the strongest people put the heaviest things so the rest of us can keep walking. Hadwin believed that small lies disappeared if no one counted them. Roscoe believed one dirty deal could be buried far enough that it would stop being real. Elena believed that photographs and receipts could be paid away and forgotten. They were all wrong. Some debts do not vanish simply because no one is speaking of them. Some truths wait quietly, with all the patience of a man who has been driving the same road for 32 years, until the people who created them are finally forced to sit across a table and read the total. Silas kept his records in a green ledger. Time kept the rest. So, if you are listening to this and you have a family that treated you like you were already invisible, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not have to become cruel just because cruel people hurt you. You do not have to be the loudest person in the room to be the most powerful one in it. You do not have to chase anyone down and beg them to admit what they did. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is keep your name clean, keep your records careful, keep your spine straight, and let time finish the sentence that anger started. Because people who underestimate you are usually revealing far more about themselves than they are about you. And people who treat you like you are already gone are often the first ones to disappear the moment truth walks through the door. My brother Silas taught me that after he was already in the ground. He taught me that love does not always stand on a stage or ask for applause. Sometimes love drives 90 miles on a Tuesday morning. Sometimes it sits on a porch during a thunderstorm, so a child is not afraid. Sometimes it pays a debt in silence so someone else can die, believing the best about people who never deserved that much mercy. And sometimes, after 32 years, love leaves behind a steel box, a handwritten card, and enough documented truth to put every greedy soul exactly where they belong. I still drive to Marlow Springs every second Tuesday. I still order the meatloaf. I still leave a big tip. And then I sit on Junebug's porch, while little Silas Augustus does his homework at the kitchen table inside, the door open between us so I can hear him when he has a question. He thinks I have always been part of his life. I let him believe that. Maybe one day, when he is older, I will tell him about the man whose name he carries. I will tell him that Silas was not wealthy because he had money. He was wealthy because he understood that real love is patient and consistent and does not require an audience to be worth something. If I leave that boy anything, I hope it is not only property. I hope it is that lesson.
If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about betrayal, truth, and the kind of justice that finally brings peace. And leave a comment below. Have you ever discovered someone you loved had been carrying a secret that changed everything you thought you knew?
Dignity is not what people give you. Dignity is what no one can take.